There's a general vibe on the left right now of shock and awe. The idea that a party like One Nation could be so big and so popular, it seems to baffle a lot of people. When I say left, I'm talking mostly about centre left, liberal to Greens kind of people who seem to think that One Nation is this unique evil that's sprouted out of nowhere in our otherwise pretty good representative democracy. And therefore, fighting Pauline Hanson and One Nation is like this separate thing that you do as opposed to everything else that you do as a political party or as an organization or as an individual. Really treating the far right as novel. And sure, sometimes there's some discussion about the far right being a symptom of some kind of nebulous critique of capitalism. But by and large, the actual practice of these organizations and people, it treats One Nation as this kind of phenomena that we can't explain and that we have to dedicate all these resources specifically to fight it. Now, don't get me wrong, that is true in a narrow sense. You do need some kind of specific and special response to the far right. But there is this tendency to kind of treat One Nation and by extension the broader side of conservative politics as this kind of truism of evil that will sprout up at points of history, and that's when we need to kind of rise up and meet the moment and beat them back. And a lot of people right now are kind of asking, well, why aren't, people on, again, from the very, very center of left to the more, socialisty circles, why isn't there a more cohered, significant response from the left? And the reason why there isn't this kind of big, significant response that people are looking for is because of the way people view the problem. It's really integral and important that you understand why political parties like One Nation, why there has been a general vibe shift towards the right over the past few years, in Australia at least. It's really important to understand why that has been the case. Outside of thoughts terminating cliches and, putting them on this pedestal, well, they just have really, really bad ideas and for some reason people are listening to them. Even the argument that Australia has always been a racist settler colony, you're getting on the right track, but I feel like that even that is an incomplete way of assessing the situation, because you can explain away any kind of movement in society by pointing to a very, very broad history that, for the record, does loom over our society, but it's, again, too broad to explain specific social movements and particularly why One Nation is rising the way it is. In my view, the first step to understand particular political phenomena is to understand these social forces at play. What do I mean by that, right? I'm going to give you a really, really niche example to illustrate my point. Transport back to the 1980s, right? We're back in the 1980s, 1982 specifically. You're a union delegate at the 1982 ALP conference watching the then federal leader of the Labor Party, Bill Hayden, speak. And Bill Hayden says this: if the unions don't sign to the Prices and Incomes Accord, the Labor Party would have at their disposal only fiscal and monetary measures, quite brutal and severe in their impact. Now, I promise this is relevant. The reason why I bring this up is because here Bill Hayden is kind of saying the quiet part out loud. He's saying that ALP policy will be essentially shaped by the participation of unions. And the reason why this is a brilliant example of what I'm talking about is that the union movement, both today, but particularly back then, given membership was much higher, the union movement was kind of the representation of working class issues. If you wanted to do something in regards to, working class issues, you would go to the unions. And so all the really big policies that were quite beneficial to working people, for example, Medicare, these were things that were only legislated because the unions participated in the process of introducing that legislation. And Hayden is kind of saying here in a pretty brutal ultimatum to the unions, if you don't get behind us, we're not going to implement all these big social programs that you want for your members, the working class, and we're going to do fiscal austerity. We're going to cut all these social programs that do already exist. So this is a really, really roundabout way of saying that the particular social forces at play, and in this case, it was the relationship between an organized working class and a parliamentary party, that relationship signified the particular social forces at play. It wasn't the great ideas of particular Labor ministers that brought Medicare into existence. It wasn't the great ideas of, particular politicians that brought anything into existence. All political change comes into existence as a result of the interplay between different social forces. At the time, an organized working class was one social force, different factions of capital were other social forces. So I want to drill into your head that political parties are vessels for particular factions of different social classes. And the relationships and interplay between these different social forces, they all mesh into this one kind of big orchestra, if you will. And the music as a result of the orchestra is state policy. With all that being said, how then do we understand One Nation? Well, it's kind of easy to lambast One Nation as a party for the big end of town, which a lot of kind of center-left, even union types have been doing across social media for the past few weeks. And look, I don't necessarily have a problem with that on its own. I think that's fine. But I think it betrays a bit of a misunderstanding as to what One Nation is and why One Nation is actually getting a lot of support in what we traditionally consider the working class. If you work at a union, if you work in the union movement, join Rahu. If you work in union spaces, you will know that there has been an unusual rise in One Nation in the rank and file. I won't name names, but there have been some unions that have even collaborated or been openly sympathetic to One Nation. And again, this isn't because, of the character of particular union leaders. No, this is them responding to the particular conditions that they see. And what they see is that a lot of their members don't mind One Nation, that they're sympathetic towards them. And I don't think it can all be chalked up to racism. Don't get me wrong, One Nation, incredibly racist. They're racist. There's no denying that. But I think owing their rise at the moment in Australia to just this idea of racism, I think misses the mark a bit. So where did One Nation come from? Well, we'll have to go back to the 1990s to figure that out, because that's when the Australian economy globalized or was undergoing the process of globalization. In the 1980s and 1990s, the Hawke and Keating governments oversaw a paradigmatic change in the Australian economy. Important for us today is globalization and financialization. One of the really, really big things that Hawke and Keating did was make Australia globally competitive, right? And what that means is that if it's cheaper or more productive or more efficient for a particular company to make something overseas, they'll close up shop here in Australia. And that happened to a lot of manufacturing where it was just cheaper and more profitable to go overseas and manufacture in countries where wages are lower, there's less labor protections, there's less pesky unions to deal with, and that was the case in Australia. But on top of that, it wasn't just capital leaving Australia, there was also a new kind of capital coming into Australia, and it took on this more multinational financial character. And these multinationals would often outcompete or bid up or purchase small to medium existing businesses here in Australia. So you had this combination of workers losing their blue-collar, secure union jobs to globalization as the companies were moving overseas, and you had small business owners were being outcompeted by multinationals. Two distinct groups of people who may have had antagonistic relationships, may have not, who were previously relatively more secure in that arrangement before the 1980s, who were then thrown into a space of precarity. And you can debate the merits of the Accord and globalization and neoliberalism all you want, but this was the objective consequence of such. There was this alienation of these different groups of society who were more secure in the previous paradigm. And this shared gripe with globalization between blue-collar workers who lost their secure jobs and small business owners who were being outcompeted by multinational firms, they kind of began to coalesce, and they coalesced into what we now know today as Pauline Hanson's One Nation. So just to reiterate, what we commonly known as neoliberalism, but specifically globalization and financialization, threw these different social classes into a state of precarity, and they responded or reacted by creating a kind of cross-class alliance in the form of a political party, Pauline Hanson's One Nation. I'll throw in a big caveat there, with the exception of Queenslanders, because of course, most of these disaffected blue-collar workers and small business owners went over to the Liberal Party. Hence the term Howard's Battlers kind of came about. Now, One Nation kind of remained dormant for a long time after the 1990s or early 2000s. It had a kind of brief period of success, but it died down quite significantly. And I think that can be chalked up to the fact that Australia just got pretty fucking wealthy in that time period. We didn't experience a financial crisis here in 2008. Things were relatively smooth sailing. In my view, the economic fallout after COVID then cemented the conditions that we've seen in other countries that have had insurgent far rights. I think after COVID, that's when those conditions began to emerge in Australia. And it goes back to, again, globalization and financialization. What have we seen after COVID? Well, after years of record low interest rates, of really, really expansionary monetary policy, making it easy to borrow money, access credit as either a small business owner, as an aspiring homeowner, even as a regular consumer, right? After that, we saw one of the sharpest increases in the cash rate in Australian history. And so even though interest rates are still by historical standards quite low, the relative feeling of precariousness is quite high because only like a couple of years ago, people weren't paying what they are paying now on their interest. The point about interest rates is particularly pertinent in my opinion because where in other times in history where interest rates were jacked up in Australia, the majority of homeowners and therefore the plurality of the country owns their home outright. And through the 2010s, we saw that demographic change because of, high house price growth. We saw that demographic change to now the majority of homeowners and therefore the majority of Australians are mortgage holders. They're in debt, and so they're incredibly sensitive to interest rate changes. It's kind of what the discourse around negative gearing has revealed, that a lot of these landlords are running at a loss. And so again, debt that's incredibly sensitive to interest rate changes. Combine that with the fact that real wages have fallen to 2010 levels, and the long run trends of casualization, deunionization, that kind of thing, you start to paint a bit of a picture as to the economic conditions that underpin the rise of a party like One Nation. And then on top of that, you have a lot of multinational investment in Australia, particularly around renewable energy. And there's a perception that renewable energy is displacing, good, secure mining jobs here in Australia. I think that's become a pretty apparent factor represented by electorates like Hunter, where there's a lot of mining, and the two major parties there aren't Liberal and Labor, but Liberal and One Nation, and that's been the case for a couple of years now. The reason why I'm going through all of this is because all of this shows you who your enemy is or what your enemy is. Your enemy isn't One Nation. These trends or these movements in society, they are happening regardless of One Nation or not. One Nation, God forbid they get elected into power, would, intensify various different processes. They would be accelerationists in that kind of sense, right? They would accelerate the poor material conditions. But One Nation aren't the progenitor of poor material conditions, like again some I think are trying to imply. They are products of the poor conditions that we live in right now. And again, sure, they would accelerate those poor conditions, and I don't think they care about those poor conditions, to be frank. But if you want to fight One Nation, you have to fight the social forces that move it. The social forces behind political parties that are in power right now. Because while One Nation represents the reaction to globalization, financialization, neoliberalism, the Labor Party right now are proactively affirming those kind of political phenomena. Welcoming in global capital, exporting capital via its financial wing, the superannuation industry. Financializing social welfare policy, like for example, through the Housing Australia Future Fund. The consequences of Labor Party policy is what creates parties like One Nation. Again, this isn't particular to the Labor Party. The Labor Party is again the result of those, different social forces enmeshing into one kind of, blob and then spitting out the, synthesis of what they all think. It would be the reality of any party that had governed for the past 20, 30 years. So when you're fighting against One Nation, I want you to remember that that's what you're fighting against. You're not fighting against the nebulous idea of Pauline Hanson's One Nation. You're not fighting against this idea of racism per se. You're fighting against the forces that coalesce into these various political phenomena. To me, the best way to do that is union organizing. It's to join your union. It's to unionize your workplace, unionize your house if you're a renter. I think organizing around class is really important. And from there, we can springboard to a lot of other things. I think Pauline Hanson will show her true colors in regards to working people pretty quickly and has been, if you look at polling, whenever Pauline Hanson talks about anything to do with industrial relations, she goes down in the polls. I think people will realize that, and in part it's up to, people like us to actually communicate that to, union members or whatever. That's the thing about these parties that represent the petty bourgeois. They can only toe the kind of common man line so much because at the end of the day, they are still bourgeois. They still operate to exploit that uneven relationship between capital and labor, between boss and worker. And so they'll can out the worker if it's suitable to their position. And, Pauline Hanson has been doing exactly that by getting all these free rides from Gina Reinhardt. So yeah, I think the best thing we can do is tackle the actual social forces behind people like Pauline Hanson. And doing that means getting involved in your union, organizing your workplace. Because that not only builds the kind of movements that people look towards for significant action on the far right. This kind of organization is self-empowering. You kind of realize that without, you or your coworker or you and your housemate, your boss, your landlord, they can't run their operations. They can't sell things for their company. They can't run a rental. And so ultimately, collectively, you guys have the leverage.